While millions of viewers around the globe binge-watch fictional survival dramas on Netflix, a real terrifying struggle for survival has been unfolding just beyond the spotlight. For 12 years, a North Korean supervisor lived in a world where Hollywood movies were contraband, but real-world exploitation was the daily norm. He watched his workers live packed inside shipping containers, while their stolen wages were converted into the very ballistic missiles dominating today's global news headlines. This is the staggering true story of a man who bridged the gap between a closed totalitarian nightmare and the free world. Bridge the gap. Subscribe to connect with stories from the other side of the DMZ. North Korea is in absolute chaos. At a construction site in Vladivostok, Russia, a site manager who spent 12 years counting Kim Jong-un's dirty dollars vanished overnight. But before he fled, he did one final thing. He burned a 12-year ledger of state-mandated extortions. Those numbers turned to ash records showing how 340 workers bled and sweated, only to take home a measly $18 each, while the rest was funneled straight to Pyongyang. Exactly how much wealth was hidden in that ledger? And why did a man who proved his loyalty for over a decade decide to abandon everything? Before we begin, please subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. It always warms my heart to see your replies. Now let us begin today's story. To be completely honest with you, I was thrilled the day I was assigned to Russia. I was 39 years old at the time. Born and raised in the Nuremberg district of Pyongyang, I was a third-generation member of a dedicated Workers' Party family. My father and grandfather had spent their entire lives serving the party before they passed away. Born into such a household, I naturally followed the same path. When my assignment came through from the Bureau of Overseas Construction, everyone around me was deeply envious. They told me, "Hyok, you've finally made it." In North Korea, an overseas deployment was an incredible privilege. They only sent individuals with proven loyalty, spotless family backgrounds, and those the higher-ups trusted implicitly never to harbor a single thought of defection. As many of you know, leaving North Korea back then was a far bigger deal than a corporate executive being posted abroad today. Women from the neighborhood would visit my mother just to say, "Oh, Hyok's mother, your son has become a true pillar of the nation." To celebrate, my mother made dubu jjigae, a traditional tofu stew, that evening. It was the exact dish she cooked whenever something wonderful happened to our family. Even now, I can still recall that rich aroma. It was late autumn in 2013 when I first set foot in Vladivostok. After an 11-hour train ride, the Russian landscape that greeted me was nothing like I had imagined. The sky felt vast. The land stretched on forever, and the buildings were grand and magnificent structures I had never witnessed back home. At that moment, I had no inkling of what my duties would truly entail, or how this land would alter the entire course of my life. My responsibilities covered 3 active construction sites across Vladivostok and Khabarovsk. I was the overseer for a total of 340 deployed North Korean workers. While my official title was Site Management Supervisor, my actual job came down to a single task. Every single month, I collected the workers' wages from the Russian contractors, divided the cash according to a strict predetermined ratio, and wired the regime's mandatory portion back to Pyongyang. Whatever remained was distributed to the men. In the beginning, it seemed completely natural. The state had granted us this opportunity, so it was only right to give back to the state. That was the exact doctrine we had been taught our entire lives. None of the 340 workers ever dared to voice a complaint. They knew precisely what happened to anyone who stepped out of line. The workers lived in modified shipping containers. 8 men crammed into a space barely over 200 square feet. The Russian winters were brutal. In suffocating temperatures that routinely dropped past -4 degrees Fahrenheit, they labored from 6 o'clock in the morning until the sun went down. Yet, those North Korean men worked without a word of complaint. Or rather, they knew they couldn't afford to complain. Because I was the supervisor, I slept in a warmer room and ate better food. I took it for granted. Back then, I really did. Then came our very first payday. The Russian site manager handed me a thick, heavy envelope. It contained the monthly wages for all 340 men. I returned to my quarters, opened my ledger, and began calculating those numbers myself for the very first time. It is difficult to find the right words to describe what I felt that night as I tapped on my calculator. The next month, and the month after that, I kept updating that ledger. The exact same figures repeated themselves every single month. And very slowly, bit by bit, the dark reality behind those numbers began to dawn on me. I will never forget the night I opened that ledger for the first month. Inside the envelope from the Russian contractor was the total payout for our 340 workers. The Russian company paid 200 US dollars per month for each laborer. For 340 men, that amounted to $68,000. I laid the cash out on my desk, opened the ledger, and began the math based strictly on the directives sent down from Pyongyang. The state's cut was 85%. I punched the numbers into my calculator. 85% of $68,000 meant $57,800 went straight to Pyongyang. That left just $30 for an individual worker. But it didn't stop there. Another $12 was deducted for site operations and food expenses. In the end, the actual amount placed into a worker's hand was exactly $18. For a long time, I just stared blankly at the calculator screen. $18. That was the total compensation for working 12 hours a day, 26 days a month, out in the freezing Russian wilderness from dawn till dusk. It amounted to less than $1 a day. Some of you might recall the dark history of World War II, when occupying forces confiscated crops from starving farmers, leaving them with nothing but worthless husks. What I witnessed that night was no different. Only the terminology had changed. Instead of forced wartime requisition, they called it a state contribution. Instead of slave labor, they called it an overseas deployment. The packaging was different, but the exploitation was identical. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I went out to the site and looked at the workers' faces. There was 45-year-old Mr. Choe from Hamgyong Province, 32-year-old Mr. Park from Ryanggang Province, and Mr. Kim, a man in his 50s from Pyongyang Province. They were already working silently in the freezing cold. They kept going, knowing they would only receive $18, or perhaps they didn't even know that much yet. I couldn't bring myself to look them in the eye. But what shook me even more was what came next. As the second and third months passed, I began calculating the cumulative total of these figures, $57,800 every single month. That meant $693,600 a year. Just from the 3 sites under my supervision, over $2 million was being funneled to Pyongyang every year. So what about the rest of Russia? What about the rest of the world? One evening I sat down and did the math alone. Local rumors suggested that there were over 50,000 officially deployed North Korean workers worldwide, and likely over 100,000 including unofficial ones. Even by conservative estimates, 50,000 workers yielding $170 a month meant $8.5 million monthly. Annually, that was roughly $100 million flowing directly into Kim Jong-un's private vaults. After completing the math, I looked down at my hands. These very hands had divided that money every month. These hands had recorded those figures in the ledger. These hands were acting as an accomplice. For the first time, my hands began to tremble, and it wasn't from the Russian cold. It was an evening during my second year. I occasionally had dinner with Sergei, the Russian manager in charge of the site. Our meetings were meant for official coordination, but once a bottle of vodka was introduced, our conversations tended to drift. That night was no exception. Sergei was the type who grew talkative after a few drinks. "Seong-hyuk, can I ask you something honestly?" he suddenly inquired. "You're the one who hands out the wages to your workers. How much do they actually get to keep?" We've always wondered where the money we pay them actually goes. I hesitated. But looking at Sergei, I could tell he already suspected the truth. I replied carefully. "A portion is sent back to cover state operating expenses." Sergei let out a cynical chuckle. "State operating expenses, that's a nice way to put it. We use phrases like that here too. But Seong-hyuk, my friends in the intelligence service tell me that money goes straight into your nuclear program." I went back to my room that night and stared at the ceiling for hours. The nuclear program. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, the secret funds of Office 39. Deep down, I had already known. But knowing it in the back of your mind is entirely different from hearing it directly from an outsider. Sergei's words were burned into my memory. I started calculating again, looking at the grand total. The cumulative amount sent to the regime from my 3 sites over 2 years was $4 million. And based on the annual $200 million extracted from all overseas workers over the past decade, the total reached $2 billion. $2 billion? Through snippets of information circulating among the local Korean diaspora and news filtering in from Russia and China, I knew that developing a single nuclear missile cost anywhere from tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. Information that was completely blocked inside North Korea floated like air on Russian soil. The sweat and blood of 340 men receiving $18 a month had ultimately become missiles screaming into the sky. Logically, I understood it, but my heart refused to accept it. Perhaps I simply didn't want to admit it, because the moment I acknowledged the truth, the meaning of everything I had done would completely unravel. From that period onward, the way I viewed the workers changed entirely. Before, they were just personnel to manage. They were numbers 340 entries in a ledger. But now I saw individual faces. Mr. Choi from Pyongyang had left 2 elementary school-age sons back home. Mr. Park from Pyongyang had come here to earn money for his ailing mother's medicine. Could $18 a month pay for a mother's medicine? Could it buy school supplies for 2 young boys? I knew the answer perfectly well, yet I forced myself to look away. Another year passed like that. But as my 3rd year began, things occurred that made it impossible to look away any longer. In the spring of 2021, I was granted a temporary leave to return home. It was an annual privilege. The journey from Russia back to Pyongyang was always filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety because my wife and young daughter were waiting for me. My daughter had been 12 when I first left for Russia. Watching her grow taller each year was the greatest joy of those trips home. But that year was different. When I arrived at our home in Pyongyang, my wife was nowhere to be seen. My daughter sat entirely alone in the room. She was 16 now, and her eyes were severely swollen from crying. Father, mother is gone. My wife had passed away that winter from cholecystitis, a gallbladder inflammation. In a normal country, it was a simple illness cured by a routine operation. But the hospital in Pyongyang lacked proper surgical tools, ran desperately short on anesthetics, and we lacked the funds to pay for the necessary medication. The supervisor stipend I received in Russia was meager, and the money I could send back home was always incredibly tight. I sat motionless in that empty room for a very long time. North Korea proudly guaranteed free health care. It was a core lesson we were taught from childhood, the superiority of the socialist system and the blessings of universal care. But in reality, that promise had vanished long ago. Healthcare without money was non-existent, even in the capital city of Pyongyang. My daughter told me that on the day her mother was turned away from the hospital, she went door to door begging neighbors for any medicine. She couldn't find a single pill. My wife drew her final breath while holding our daughter's hand. I listened to the entire story in absolute silence, and a single thought refused to leave my mind: those numbers I recorded in the ledger every month. $57,800. If I had been allowed to keep even a fraction of that money, my wife would still be alive today. A gallbladder surgery would have cost only a few $100s. Instead, that wealth vanished through Pyongyang into a black hole, perhaps to build a missile or to line the vaults of Office 39. My wife's life had been weighed against Kim Jong-un's missiles. Sitting on the train back to Russia, staring out the window, I felt a cold, deep rage toward the regime take root inside me. Before, it had been doubt, suspicion, and discomfort. But from that day forward, it was anger. A quiet, freezing, inextinguishable anger. I never showed that rage to anyone. I couldn't. I simply kept writing in the ledger, dividing the cash, and wiring the state's cut. Outwardly, I acted as if nothing had changed. But deep inside, something was shattering completely. It was the summer of 2025. During my brief return home that year, I discovered that my 18-year-old daughter had been forcibly conscripted into the military. Left entirely alone in an empty house after her mother's death, she had been taken to a military base 2 months before my arrival. A 7-year mandatory service for women her entire 20s wiped out in an instant. Shortly after returning to Russia, an even more devastating blow arrived regarding my eldest son. He was already serving his military duty. That autumn, word reached me that his unit had been placed on the deployment roster for Russia, consigned to the active combat zone in Kursk. The moment I heard the word Kursk, my legs gave out. Through the uncensored information flowing around Russia, I knew exactly what that place was. I knew how defenseless the deployed North Korean soldiers were against drones and long-range artillery. I knew the casualty rates were staggering, reaching 40%. 4 out of every 10 young men were returning in body bags or permanently maimed. And the horror hit even closer to home. Shortly after, I discovered that 3 workers from my own broader network had been transferred to a work detail near Kursk and killed. Yet the official report sent back to Pyongyang listed their deaths as accidental construction fatalities. Their families back home would never know how their sons truly died. That night, I went back to my quarters and pulled out the ledgers. 12 years of records, 12 years of the exact same numbers filling every single page. $57,800. $57,800. I calculated the grand total. 3 sites, 12 years. Approximately $8.3 million. That was the exact amount of wealth my hands had funneled to Pyongyang. That money built the very missiles my son was now facing. My wife died because we lacked a few $100s for medicine. My daughter was trapped in a military uniform for 7 years. Slowly, I closed the ledger. I grabbed a metal bucket from the corner of the room. I struck a lighter. It didn't take long for 12 years of records to burn. Watching the paper curl into black ash, I found that I couldn't even cry. Instead, a single crystal-clear realization remained. I had to get out. From the moment I made my decision, I maintained absolute composure. 12 years as an overseer had trained me well for this. Concealing emotions and controlling my facial expressions were survival skills etched into my body. The next morning, I walked out to the construction site just like any other day. I gave orders to the men, coordinated with the Russian managers, and returned to my room to sleep. I acted as if nothing was amiss. But inside my mind, I was mapping out an escape route. Evading North Korean surveillance in Vladivostok was incredibly difficult. The State Security Department had planted informants among the workers to watch one another. As a supervisor, I was under even heavier scrutiny. A defecting manager caused a massive political fallout, so there were countless eyes tracking my movements. I quietly turned to the local connections I had built over 12 years. Not Sergei, he was part of the official apparatus. Instead, I contacted a member of the local ethnic Korean community, a third-generation permanent resident named Andrei who ran a small trading business in Vladivostok. We had occasionally shared private dealings over the decade. I approached him with immense caution. I have urgent business in Moscow. I need to get there outside the official channels. Andrei stared at me for a brief moment, then nodded silently. He didn't ask a single question. He knew exactly what a North Korean asking for such a favor truly wanted. 3 days later, I held forged travel documents in my hand, claiming I was heading out for an inspection of the Khabarovsk site. That cleared the first major checkpoint out of Vladivostok. I boarded the train not toward Khabarovsk, but in the exact opposite direction, toward Moscow. Russia was vast. The train ride took a full week. I spent those long days staring out at the passing landscape. Looking at the endless Siberian plains, my thoughts drifted constantly to my children left behind. Where was my son stationed right now? What brutal tasks was my daughter enduring? Who was tending to my wife's grave? When I finally reached Moscow, I met another contact arranged by Andrei. I didn't even ask for his name. He simply placed me onto a long-haul bus bound for Warsaw, Poland. It was an overland route straight into Europe. The journey from Vladivostok to Warsaw took 10 agonizing days, the longest, quietest days of my entire life. It was mid-September 2025 when I arrived in Warsaw, Poland. I stood outside the South Korean embassy for a long time, watching the South Korean flag flutter in the wind. I didn't feel an immediate rush of joy or even relief. It felt as though a lifetime of exhaustion had finally caught up with me all at once. I knocked on the embassy door. A diplomatic official emerged, and I spoke the words I had prepared. I am a North Korean citizen. I wish to defect to the Republic of Korea. The official's expression hardened for a split second, then softened completely. He welcomed me inside into a warm room and handed me a hot cup of tea. I had never felt so profoundly grateful for something so simple. 2 days later, an intelligence official arrived from Seoul. Our debriefing was extensive. I pulled out every single memory from the past 12 years. 340 workers, a $200 monthly wage, an 85% extortion rate, an $18 take-home pay, $2 million sent back annually from 3 sites, a 12-year total of $8.3 million. I detailed the exact routing channels, the specific bank accounts used, the names of the regime handlers, and the identities of the Russian collaborators. The official recorded everything meticulously. Then he looked up. "Where are the ledgers?" I answered truthfully. "I burned them. But I remember every single digit. I am the man who calculated those numbers every month for 12 years. The official stared at me intently for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Left alone in my room after the interview, I looked out the window. The autumn sky over Warsaw was incredibly high and clear. It was the first time in over a decade that I had truly looked up at the sky. In North Korea, we never had the luxury to look up. In Russia, I lived in constant fear of exposure. But that night, knowing I no longer had anything to hide, the world felt infinitely wider. For the first time in my life, I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. I finally arrived in South Korea in the late autumn of 2025. Stepping off the plane at Incheon International Airport, I stood frozen. People hurried past in every direction. Announcements echoed through the terminals, and the brightly lit duty-free shops dazzled my eyes. Despite living in Russia for 12 years, the sheer vibrant reality of freedom left me completely awestruck. During my time at Hanwon, the Resettlement Education Center, I was finally able to access global news without restriction. One evening, while eating in the dining hall, a television broadcast caught my eye and I dropped my spoon. The news was reporting on a United Nations investigation into North Korean human rights abuses. The screen displayed statistics on overseas laborers: an 85 to 92% wage confiscation rate, an average monthly take-home pay of $15 to $30, and an estimated $1.5 to $2 billion funneled annually to the regime. They were the exact numbers I had calculated every single month for 12 years. A Hanwon staff member sitting nearby noticed my reaction and asked, "Is everything all right?" I replied quietly, "Those numbers. I am the man who counted them." The staff member went completely silent. My friends, if there is one profound truth I have realized since arriving in South Korea, it is this. The reality of North Korea's wealth is not the cold cash sitting inside a state vault. It is the blood and sweat of 340 men. It is the price of a human life valued at $18 a month. It is the gallbladder surgery my wife never received. It is the dangerous front line where my son stands, and the 7-year military uniform my daughter wears. The regime's money is nothing more than the lives and time of its people converted into dollars. Nothing more, nothing less. And that very system is beginning to fracture. When exploitation reaches its absolute limit, the people being exploited begin to disappear. The pool of overseas laborers shrinks, overseers choose to run away, and the families of soldiers killed in secret details eventually discover the truth. The cracks are spreading quietly but unstoppably. No ledger is thick enough, and no wall is high enough to stop those fractures. Every single day I pray for the survival of my son and the health of my daughter left behind. If unification comes and I can finally return to my hometown, I want to stand before my wife's grave and say these words to her: "That surgery money you never received. I have finally revealed the truth to the entire world. Please never forget how precious the freedom you enjoy every day truly is. And please remember those who are still forced to live on $18 a month across the border. I pray with all my heart that the day of freedom arrives for them within our lifetime. Thank you." This video is a creative dramatization based on the actual testimonies of North Korean defectors, adapted with the assistance of AI. Names, characters, places, and incidents are the products of creative storytelling.